The world around us is hostile to the Word of God and to biblical values, but we are called to be salt and light, to stand for truth in a decaying culture. We are not called to run from the fire, but be willing to step into the fire. God has placed you at this time in history on purpose and for a purpose. Join us as we get better equipped to address civics and culture from a biblical worldview. Welcome to Into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church. Let's welcome our hosts Alison and Debi Vandenboom.
Today's topic is using wisdom in the primary election. Debi, we have a lot to go over with the primary elections that are happening all across the nation. And I'm really excited about this topic because this is practical application of civics. This is where we get involved at the local level, and it starts with understanding some of these basic principles. So when it comes to choosing leaders in the political space, we are called to use wisdom, right? Not only for our own benefit, but for the benefit of the country. And we have to be wise and understand that there are a lot of different pieces that go into politics and the realities of what's happening in the world. And really, our focus today is to help you dissect what this is, but not just picking our favorite candidates, but picking the candidates that have the best chance of winning the general in November.
Yes.
So the first kind of question that I want to go over, this is kind of like a challenge to everybody, is, when we're talking about candidates, do you have bias? Like when you're choosing, so the primary, right? Let's go over a little bit of what it is. You have all of the candidates for one given race. So for senator, governor, whatever it is, right? And let's say there can be anywhere from 2 to 5 or 6, whatever, depending on the race. But
sometimes there's only one.
Yeah, sometimes there's only one, and that's also a strategy. So when we have all of these options for candidates, the primary election is to narrow it down to the one candidate that is going to, compete, as I like to say, compete in the November election.
Right. And I think that confuses people sometimes. Like if you're only paying, a little bit of attention to what's going on, the difference between a primary and a general election can be a little bit confusing. And so that's a really good explanation that you're looking at just within one party, you're picking your top contender in all of those different races that then is going to go on to like the championship ballot,
yes.
Right? It's like if you're looking at a sports analogy, right, that you're moving on from the first level to the second round, right?
Yes.
Who is going to compete just one person from one party, one person from another party in that. So one person for Senate in Arizona, the Arizona senator for the Republican Party and for the Democrat Party, and those two will go head to head in November. But we're choosing in the primaries who that's going to be that goes on the ballot.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think in the political space, it's a really interesting conversation because you can almost argue that even though the primary has a much smaller turnout than the general, as far as how many people actually show up for that election, right?
Right.
But it's arguably the more important election because let's say you have 5 candidates and one of them is the person that could actually win the entire election, right? And the other 3 or 4 are great candidates. They have good qualities, but they might not win.
Right.
So who we choose to go through, to this general election in November is really important for if we're going to win that seat or not.
Right. And I think it even goes farther back than that, right? Because what you're saying is a really great point that the primary election, so many people don't even pay attention to it.
Right.
They don't vote in it. They don't really, but that really determines. So then you get to the general election, you're like, well, I don't like either of these people. Well,
right.
Then you should have paid attention a lot sooner than that, because it's also who gets on the ballot in the first place in the primary election, right? It's who decides to run and who gets the most support and who gets those signatures to get on the ballot in the primary election as well. So again, if you're looking in November and you don't like your 2 choices of people that you have, then next election, get involved in the process a lot earlier and help determine who those people are that are going to be running in the primary election. And then also make sure that you're paying attention in the primaries, because I agree, I think it's more important.
Right.
When it gets down to 2 choices, it's just one or the other. But when you have a primary election, often you have a lot more options to choose from.
Right. And I think we have 2 major problems when it comes to getting people engaged in this piece. So the first one is that everybody's going to have their favorite candidate, right? Everybody's going to have somebody that, these candidates, if you have not been to any events, they're very accessible. You can meet them in person. You can shake their hand, right? You can, oftentimes, depending on what seat it is, you can get coffee with them, or you can, talk to them for 10 minutes. And people develop personal relationships with these candidates. And that's great. That's how it should be. However, we see far too often that people are very one-sided with, well, this is the candidate that I like the best, so this is who I think should win. Right? And when it comes to who's going to win an election, there's a lot of strategy that has to be involved in getting that candidate elected.
Right.
And we have to understand the dynamics of the political sphere to be able to, have a bigger perspective than just saying, well, I like this candidate the best.
Right.
Because the question that always comes to my mind is, I can have my favorite candidate, but who is going to beat the other side in the general?
Right.
And that comes down to specifically Arizona, but this is, nationwide, this is a huge issue, that who are the majority of people in your states? What are they registered as, right? What party are they registered with? And with Arizona, we have a high level of independence. We have 33% independence in Arizona.
Right. It's pretty evenly split. It's like third, roughly, right?
Yes.
It's not exactly, but yeah. So you have, roughly a third Republicans, a third Democrats, and a third independents or no party. So those independents and no party really make a big difference in an election.
Right. So if we have 33% independents right now in Arizona, we have to think, what is going to pull their vote? What candidate is going to attract those people, because we need them to win?
Right. And sometimes, too, it's not even that those people are really, it's kind of a, toss-up as far as why they've chosen to not have a party, because sometimes it's not that they are not conservative or liberal or whichever category they might fall into, but that they're fed up with parties, or that they don't understand the two parties. So we can't even, they're a little bit harder to determine which way they're going to go, because they are kind of up in the air sometimes as far as which way they're going to lean, and what's going to move them to the polls and move them to vote for a certain candidate. But they're extremely important.
Yeah, absolutely. So when thinking about the primary, we've got a couple of common questions that we get all the time.
Right.
So I want to go over some of those and answer some of these basic questions. So talking about voter registration, do you need to update your voter registration every election? Yeah,
so this is a question. I do voter registration tables all the time. We do them here at church, and I get this question a lot. We already answered one of those questions that I get is, what's the difference between a primary and a general election? People often don't understand that. But as far as voter registration goes, no, once you are registered to vote, if nothing changes, you continue to be registered to vote. You don't, you're not removed and have to re-register. If you have changed your name, so if you have gotten married or divorced or whatever, and your name is different on your driver's license, you need to change your voter registration. If you've moved, which that is a really common one in Arizona,
yes.
People move around a lot. So if you have moved, then you need to update your voter registration to match your current address. But that also means that you need to update your driver's license first.
Right.
So, and you can do those at the same time. You can go on to the motor vehicle division and update your driver's license. If you have an Arizona driver's license, you can just do that online and just change your address, get them to mail you a new card with the same photo on it. And it's like, I don't know, less than $10 to do that. And then you can update your voter registration at the same time. And also, sometimes your signature changes. This is one of those things that as you get older, your signature may look different. And so as we move more toward more scrutiny with signatures, especially if you do the mail-in ballots and you're signing it, if your signature looks nothing like it did on your driver's license, then you may want to update that as well and make sure that your signature matches. So there's a lot of reasons that you might want to update your voter registration, but you don't need to if nothing has changed. Or
right.
If you've changed parties, that's the other thing. So sometimes people were an independent, but now they're a party. They want to choose one of the parties, then that would be another reason to change your voter registration.
Yes, and something else to mention, because we hear this a lot in Arizona and really across the nation, that sometimes people will say, well, I didn't update this thing or I didn't change this thing. There are a lot of boxes, particularly with the same, like Service Arizona is what it's called here, but like the motor vehicle divisions across the nation, where there are a lot of times where when you opt in to update something else,
Right.
You are opting in to update your voter registration with that same thing or with a default setting.
Right.
And oftentimes people don't know that because those are local level things that change, legislation or policy that changes.
Right.
Like, every time you update your driver's license or you get, all these different things. So make sure that you check
Right.
every time you sign something and you check a box. It is really important because there are a lot of different places, depending on the state, that your voter registration can be updated or changed because of that.
Right. I was hearing that some before with the presidential preference election, which with the presidential preference election, you can't vote if you are no party or independent. You had to be registered as either a Republican or a Democrat in order to vote for that. And there were people who had been registered for one party, and then when they did something on the motor vehicle division, their party was changed to no party.
Yes.
And then they were not able to vote in that presidential preference election, or if they had not changed it, they wouldn't have been able to vote. They did check to make sure.
Right.
But you can also, it's a good idea to verify your voter registration before the deadline, which in Arizona is going to be July 1st. Your state, some states have already had their primary election. Other states are going to be having them soon. So wherever you are, look and see when that deadline is to register for the primary election, and just double check to make sure. You can very easily pull that up. Secretary of State's office, ballotready.org is one that you can check your voter registration across the country and make sure that everything is correct and current.
Yeah. And one other thing to mention with voter registration is there's also and I think different states have different names, but the active early voter list. It used to be called the permanent early voter list. So you'll hear PEVL or AVL is like the, what people will call it. But that being on the early voter list simply means that you get a ballot sent to you during a designated time before the election, so that you have time to fill it out at home and mail it back in. Now, in Arizona specifically, you can also just go vote early.
Right.
You can go in person and vote early, or you can vote on election day.
Right. And you can also, if you have your a mail-in ballot, you can fill that mail-in ballot, take it to one of those early voting centers and put it in a box instead of putting it in the mail. That's another option as well.
Yeah, so there's a lot of options with, how you vote, where you vote. We'll make sure we include in the notes finding your closest voting location, all of that stuff, which is really great information. But it's very easy to get it done. So
and with that, I know there's a lot of concerns over election integrity and all of those things. But what we want to make sure is that people are not so afraid that it's not going to count, that they're not going out and voting, right? So every single avenue of voting, yes, of course, there's different levels of fraud that's able to take place. Laws are passed all the time. They change in Arizona, across in the nation. Different states have different laws on that. But it's also really important. Don't say you're going to not take an early ballot because you're going to go vote on election day. If you're not actually going to go vote on election day, it's better for you to get a mail-in ballot and make sure that you actually put that ballot in, in the turn it in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rather than risking, if you really don't think you're going to actually get yourself out the door on that specific Tuesday during, between 7 and 7 and go vote, it's better to do. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, next question we have here is, if a candidate is endorsed by someone, does that mean he or she is the best candidate?
I wrote this question, but it's really loaded. No, it does not. So there's been, endorsements are tricky because people, candidates like to have them, and you may want to chime in on this one too, but candidates like to have endorsements. They are helpful, but they're really an iffy thing, because again, is it that, they're friends and so they want to endorse that person? Is there something else going on? Also, my recommendation with endorsements is the farther away you get from that person. So like if you're talking about a local race, right? Something in Arizona, I don't really care what a national person has to say about that because they're not in Arizona. Right. They don't know the ins and outs of what's going on in Arizona. And so, I mean, there were people in the last election that were endorsed by a current presidential candidate that I didn't agree with. I thought they should have been just left alone in the primaries and have nobody be endorsed and see who gets out of the primaries in Arizona, who Arizona wants to pick for that. That's my own personal opinion on that. But I do think that if you're talking about, in the Arizona, if you're working hand in hand with somebody and you work closely with that person, that endorsement to me means a little bit more because they know what that person's character is. They know how they're going to vote. We have a voting record. So you have to kind of take it with a grain of salt. Those things can be helpful, but they can also be wrong in a lot of cases, in my opinion. And I think you have to just really be careful and just take it as one piece of information and not just, this person says I should vote for so-and-so, so I'm going to do that without looking at anything else.
Right. I completely agree. Yeah, because you have to, again, in my mind always goes back to who can win the general.
Right.
Who is our true competition here, right? That's happening at the general. And so who is best equipped with, maybe it is their personality or their experience or something that is directly applicable, but it's going to be better suited to win the trophy, to win that actual election, right?
Right.
So I think of this entire thing as a competition. And if we're looking at, whatever it is, NBA, we're looking at like all these big sports, we want to pick the person who's going to win. We want to pick the best. We're objective, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to sports, everybody's like, who can we put in there that is going to win? And that's the way that I feel about the political space is I want to win. So I want to figure out who is the best candidate to go against this opponent.
Right.
So lots of fun things. So what is the best way to research candidates if you don't know somebody and you're trying to figure out, what do I do?
Yeah, so there are a lot of resources. Some of them can be a little trickier to find if someone has not ever been in office, which doesn't mean that they're not going to be a good person in that office, right? But if they've never been in office, they don't have a track record, so they're a little bit more iffy. We don't really 100% know what they're going to do. Like I remember when President Trump was elected, there were people saying he was going to do one thing or another, and we didn't know until he was actually in there what he was going to do. So because he'd never been in office, and that is just the way that it works, right? If you've never been in office, you don't have a track record. But if someone has been in office, they do have a voting record that you can look at and see where they have voted on issues that are important to you. So whatever those may be, whether for me, it's always the life issue, right? That is one of the primary thing that I look at. I want to see how strong they are on the life issue. And so I want to know how they voted and whether they're going to be strong on that issue or not. So you can look at those things. You can look at endorsements. That's part of the piece of the puzzle. You also, with endorsements, you can look at organizational endorsements, right? So you have, and I feel like those a lot of times are more accurate because if you have something like the NRA or some of the life groups, right? Like there's several of them that have endorsements, right?
Right.
Or whatever your issue is, border security or whatever it might be, those groups really heavily research on that one particular topic. So if you have an issue that's really important to you, look and see what organizations are endorsing on that specific issue. You can also look at their website, the candidate's website. They tell you everything that they believe in. And also sometimes what I always look at is what they're missing on that website.
Right.
So like if they only have certain issues, again, for me, it's the life issue, right? If they say all these things, but they have absolutely nothing about the life issue on there, that concerns me.
Right.
Because why are you not willing to say where you stand on this issue? That to me says sometimes it's just as simple as, they didn't, they're new and they didn't think about it or they didn't think it applied to their race, which is a genuine thing that sometimes happens.
Right.
But it could also be that, they're going to be wishy-washy on that issue because they don't really want to take a solid stand on it. And again, if you're a precinct committeeman, you go to these meetings, you meet candidates and you can talk to them face to face and see whether you think that they're genuine or not. So there are a lot of ways to research, listen to what they say, and really think about it in terms of what issues matter to you and especially those biblical issues of where they're going to stand on religious liberties, on life, on marriage, on school choice, things like that, right?
And that's a really good point in the opposite piece too, right? Is a lot of times people will talk about something, like if you're talking to a school board candidate and they'll say, well, what do you want to do about the border? Well, a school board candidate has nothing to do with the border, right? And so like you made a really good point of saying, knowing that it's applicable to their race, right? Because every person that is in office, I think people who aren't hyper involved kind of generalize that too, where they'll say, well, what do you think about this? Or, and I think that keying in on those biblical issues, but also knowing not all of them always apply, right? Like not all of them are going to be something that this person is allowed to vote on.
And to play devil's advocate on that, though, I still like to know what those issues are, even if they don't apply to that race, because what we've seen all the time is that somebody will go into one race and then they'll move from there, they get some recognition, and they go on and they run for something else.
Very true.
And so I want to know before they kind of get on that path of
like, where are you?
Where are you? So that I know if I want you heading down, and getting some recognition and getting more powerful in our state.
Yeah. What do you think about people who are, because this happens a lot, what do you think about people who, a candidate who has either previously been in another party or they have like a past of whatever, something that people disagree with? What would you say to that person that's running on a platform now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it just depends on whether you genuinely think that that person has had a conversion of thought, because it happens all the time. We've seen it, especially in the last few years. You have a lot of people leaving one party for another because all of a sudden their eyes are open and they realize, wait a minute, I've been lied to. I didn't know that all this stuff was going on. Or if they come to know the Lord, then they may completely change their views on certain things. So it's just a matter of trying to determine. I think it's you shouldn't just automatically dismiss that and say, oh, well, they were, now they're running as a Republican, but they were a Democrat 20 years ago. Well, why did they switch? I mean, that's what I want to know, right? It's like, so you want to know what caused that transition from one party to another. And to determine whether that's genuine or whether it's, because you can't assume that it's genuine, and you also can't assume that it's just for points, right? That it's, oh, well, this area, this party always wins, so I'm going to run for that party, because that does happen too. So you do see both types of things happening: people that have a genuine conversion of thought and people that are just playing the system.
Right. And so basically what we're kind of solidifying here is just paying attention to what's going on without doing, I mean, in my opinion, without really following the media or the attacks or the news, because it's never a justified source. And I have never read a mainstream article or watched a mainstream show that correctly portrayed a candidate or an idea or even a ballot initiative, for that matter. That I could say this is 100% accurate. No, they're never accurate. It's always skewed towards a perspective or their belief system. It's not a accurate representation. So that's where we sharpen our own minds by saying, okay, what can I learn from this candidate, from what I see from them? How do I, ask questions that are applicable, and how do I make the best decision that I think is going to help our state?
And going back to what you said at the beginning about our own biases, right? I mean, do I have, also looking at yourself and thinking, do I have a bias? Am I more likely to vote for this person because this other person told me to vote for them, right? Am I more likely to not believe that this person had an actual conversion of thought because I'm going to be suspicious? And just knowing your own biases, good or bad, right? Whichever way you tend to think, really is helpful, because it's a matter of taking in that information and praying about it too. We'll talk about praying at the end, I know, but also just really looking and trying to be objective and thinking wisely, and not just dismissing something because it, of whatever that thing is that you are more likely to believe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we kind of went through, candidate websites. There will be voter guides, which are huge, right? I know that our church has voter guides. Many churches are going to start getting them, but it is helpful to know there are tons of organizations that put just the values there, especially the biblical values like you were talking about for presidential, for a lot of these, bigger races. Here's what one candidate thinks. Here's what another candidate thinks.
Right. And there are some, it depends on where you live, right? Arizona, we do have a really good local voter guide because it gives them just a set of questions, every candidate, and asks so the candidates themselves are answering these questions, and it just publishes their answers. It's also very telling if they refuse to answer questions. That can be very telling as well. And then there are some national guides. And again, national guides are a little harder because they don't necessarily know all of the local nuances or have as much information. They're going more from a broad perspective. They can be helpful because there's several of them that have some national, where you click on your state and go to this voter guide. So those things are good resources as well. It just depends. The more resources you can look at, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get to the importance of prayer in this entire process and using that wisdom and discernment.
Yeah, so I think that's really important because, again, we're human. We have those biases. The whole process is so confusing and convoluted and there's so much deception.
Yeah.
Both intentional and unintentional, right? So, just the fact that the way that people phrase things sound like one thing or another, and sometimes they do that deliberately, trying to confuse voters. So it's very important in that to be praying for wisdom for yourself. And I always pray when I'm praying for just elected officials that God would put the person that he wants in there, and also I pray for them to come to know the Lord. Like all of these are not necessarily during the elections, but when you have just elected officials, praying for them to come to know the Lord.
Yeah.
And if they have a hardened heart, that they would be removed.
Right.
That they would be removed from that, and just praying for wisdom, praying for favor for the candidates. I always pray for favor for the candidates that know God and trust him, that they would be able to move forward and have favor.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I love that. And really putting that perspective for people that is a really important action we can take all year long is praying for those people. And, we never know how God is working through them or using them in a positive way for things that are happening,
And praying before you look at those resources, right? Pray, okay, God, help me to see what I need to see when I'm looking at this information so that I know what you want me to do. What's the best thing to do, right?
Right.
In that situation. Because God will give us discernment and wisdom for whatever we ask him to give us that for, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the verse that I have here is James 3:17. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere.
Yes.
And that's exactly what you just said, is that being sincere when you're saying, okay, God, take my bias out of it, take my, what I want it to feel like or be like out of it. What is it that you want to happen, in this nation next and in my state and in my local, in my local area? And how can I help be a part of that change?
Yeah. So, and then with that too, like just to reemphasize what we said, the goal always is to try to get the most biblically sound candidate.
Yes.
That has the best chance of winning in the general election.
Yes.
Because sometimes those are not the same person.
Yeah.
Right? You kind of have to, it's this little bit of, of a balancing act, right? Because sometimes there's somebody who's just amazing and has really great views, but they have no chance of beating, in a statewide race or whatever race they're in. And so you have to look at it with discernment. It's not just about...
Right.
I always, like I said, I'm always looking for the most pro-life candidate that can get elected.
Right.
So, for me, that's the primary thing that I look at. Because if they get the life issue right, then chances are their other views are pretty good too.
Yeah.
And by the other token, if they get that one wrong, then I don't know where their worldview is coming from. Right.
Yeah.
So
true.
it makes me question what they're thinking.
So for people that want to get more involved, for people who want to do something, whether it's at their church, in their group of friends, they want to start talking about this stuff, where is a good place to start?
Yeah, so we have here, there are lots of resources across the country that you can use, different organizations that have information. You can start doing voter registration at your church, doing just voter engagement, voter get together and talk about what ballot initiatives are on the ballot or whatever the case is. Here in Arizona, we have SALT that we, Alison and I both worked on helping to get up and running. It's not from our church, but it was a collaboration with a bunch of churches to get this. I'm going to let you explain it because you have it sitting in front of you.
Yes. So SALT is an initiative that's built under a local group here called Arizona Women of Action. And it's really about building not only biblically, but civically engaged churches who have that foundation of what is happening at the local level and how to take action in a simple, effective way.
Right.
And so what that looks like is churches, Bible studies, small groups, getting these civics, right? Like these, I am a citizen of, America, and this is how I engage at my local level in my community, being a citizen.
Yeah. And just to think about that, so like everything that we've talked about today, everything that we've talked about on all of the podcasts that we have put out are all totally allowed under those 501c3 rules. Like if you're trying to stick with the 501c3 rules, which some people, there's a whole other argument of whether or not that's even a valid thing or not. And we don't need to get into that because, it's really not valid that should have never been put into place. But that's a whole separate conversation.
Yes.
But even under those 501c3 rules, it is so easy to talk about all of this stuff because really you just cannot push a specific party or a specific candidate. And if you think about this conversation that we just had, right? We're talking about biblical values, we're talking about voters, we're talking about resources, we're talking about prayer. We're not pushing a specific candidate or a specific party. So all of that is allowed under 501c3. You can talk about all of those things. You can talk about ballot initiatives. You can say this ballot initiative is terrible, like the abortion ballot initiative that they're trying to get on the ballot. It's not officially on the ballot yet, but don't sign it. Don't vote for it if it gets, because that would allow abortion through all 9 months in our state. We're allowed to say those things under those 501c3 rules. So all of this stuff with SALT, right? And there's actually a document too that we can send you if you contact us at the church, but that talks about what churches are allowed to do, what pastors are allowed to do. So if you're a pastor or your church or if you're just wondering what is allowed under those 501c3 rules, there's some documents that show you what you can and cannot do, but it's pretty broad as long as you're not, as long as you're doing what we just talked about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's all really good information for people to know, for people to be able to activate that you can, just like you said, you can talk about all of these things.
And you should.
And you should, yes. You should talk about these things. That was always the intent, that that the church is the foundation of the city, of the area, and they help keep the morale and build those morals into the people that live here. And those morals are legislation. That is, every piece of policy has morals within it. So we can't separate those things. And I absolutely love that. But
and we can look around and see what is the result of the church backing away from that role and not stepping up. We have so much chaos going on in what is immoral being pushed all across the board. And we've talked about that a lot in other areas. But it really is time for the church to step up and be that voice and be that light. Yes. And we can help with that. But listening to this podcast, if you want to bring that into your church, check out those SALT resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll put all the information in the show notes for you to get involved. And as always, you can reach out to us if you have questions or want to talk more about it. Thank you so much for listening to Into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church.
You can listen to this podcast on Apple and Spotify and follow us on social media. Find all the info on the show notes. To learn more about Dream City Church, visit our website at dreamcitychurch.us. Thanks for listening.